Good day, everyone, and welcome to the panel discussion of the quantum governance that is taking place during the World Government Summit here in Dubai. I'm joined here by the two eminent co-authors of the quantum governance book here in our offices and online by Sir Christopher Pissarides. I'll introduce the esteemed authors in a few minutes, but first let me get into some details on how we're going to conduct this panel discussion. It's not a congressional hearing. It is a panel discussion. So it is interactive. It is being live streamed as we speak. I'll take a few minutes to introduce the topic, why it is important, and why we're here, and welcoming you all from across the globe in different time zones. And I thank you for taking the time and making the effort to be with us here. I had the pleasure myself to read the book, and I gained a lot of insights. One of the things that triggered my thought process in the book is that why is it that we economists, we have actually, idealized our profession in a sense that we thought, well, policy making is here to try and regulate markets where there are market failures. Citizens actually react to these market failures at every point in time, and citizens are supposed to be rational. Little attention did we pay to the fact that citizens have a certain absorptive capacity, that they can be overwhelmed with all the policies that have public policies, right, that have been thrusted upon them. So that made me think, if the absorptive capacity of a citizen, of an individual, is limited, how can the policymaker actually react to this? What policies? How can you actually change policy making by itself to attend to each of the citizen interest and concerns? And this is where the quantum book comes into play. These are the insights that we will be hearing from the authors in a minute, that I will introduce first. But first, we go online to the video conference of Sir Christopher Pissarides, who is the Nobel Prize Laureate of Economics and director at Whiteshield. Sir Pissarides, you have the floor, or the screen for that matter.
Welcome everyone to the Whiteshield webinar on quantum governance. I'm Sir Christopher Pissarides, the Nobel Laureate in Economic Sciences of 2010, and collaborator on the Whiteshield book on quantum governance. Governments play an increasing role in societies, pursuing a variety of policies that affect the individual. Yet many of these policies are failing. For example, progress towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals has been very slow, despite many policy efforts. We will not get there unless something fundamental changes, or at the individual level, the upskilling of the workforce needed to take advantage of modern technology, improve productivity growth, and worker well-being has also not been effective. One of the reasons is that these policies are not tailored enough to citizens' needs. Good policies are ones that are targeting the needs of individuals, but pay equal attention to the absorptive capacity of the citizen. By this, we mean the ability of the individual to absorb the policy and benefit from it. One policy does not fit all, yet policies are usually implemented across all the people, or at best across broad demographic groups, like all those with incomes below a certain level, or all those registered as disabled. The key is big data. And despite the many data sets that we now have, governments are still not using them to improve the effectiveness of their public policies. But technology allows us today to use that data and be more nuanced. We can measure needs and other dimensions, such as absorptive capacity, which can help us tailor policies more effectively to achieving the maximum citizen impact with the least cost. In our book, we build on a decade of analysis to dissect the reasons for policy failure and propose remedies to roadblocks, such as low citizen absorption capacity, especially in relation to policy complexity. Economists have repeatedly pointed out that traditional measures of well-being, such as GDP growth, are woefully inadequate. Policymakers and statisticians respond that they have to go by them because it is difficult to produce clear and transparent alternatives. Yet, we now have many surveys of people's life satisfaction to be able to make well-being an objective of policy. Policymakers are encouraged to augment measures like GDP growth with new data, directly linked to the cumulative welfare of the individual. How happy are people to live in the society that they do? Well, do workers feel about their jobs? The quantum governance framework leads to the construction of a national balance of policy table that captures the balance between government actions and capabilities on the one hand, and the absorptive capacity of the people on the other. I strongly encourage you to read the book to find out how to construct the balance of policy and use it to evaluate your government's policy performance. Data is the new currency in the digital economy, and governments are not using it yet. In our book, we show how it can be done and how to do it moving into the future. Thank you.
Insightful comments. It is my pleasure now to first introduce the authors, right? Two co-authors. After introducing myself, I forgot to do so. I'm Raed Safadi. I'm the chief economist at Whiteshield, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here, especially after having read the book. I read the book, and as I said, I gained lots of insights from reading the book. And then I thought to myself, so what are the consequences of such failures? The failure to actually take into account the citizens, each citizen's desires, concerns, ambitions, and what have you. So without further ado, I introduce Fadi Farra, Managing Director at Whiteshield, Managing Partner, at Whiteshield. Fadi, what is quantum governance? Please enlighten us.
Dr. thank you. And it's a pleasure to be with you today during the World Government Summit. It's even more a pleasure knowing that this region where we are today has been doing extraordinary things over the past few years. A word on the context, a word on the message. The context is very simple. We've moved over the last 10,000 years from a factor of production that was land to labor to capital, and government is stuck there in the age of capital. We still talk about GDP, we still talk about balance of payments, but we've moved on. We moved on to the age of data. And what we need today, and we're at an extraordinary time, we need to see how we can interpret and talk about artificial intelligence and how does this apply to public policy. There's been a lot of talks during the World Government Summit on this topic. The question is, where do we take it from here for policymakers? And this book is about one simple message. With the data at hand today, we have the opportunity to move from one-to-many policies to one-to-one policy. Imagine today in a nutshell, talking to your children, you can use your phone. With your phone, you can have one-to-one marketing. You can tailor your advertising to a certain person, and that person can buy a specific item. Now imagine the same happening for public policy. And this is not a dream. This is actually already happening in the US, in Denmark, in Germany, applied to specific areas. And that's the main message, to personalize public policy to each and every person.
Fantastic. Fadi, how do you ensure you don't leave anyone behind or outside this target?
Today, with the entire world population, imagine all the artificial intelligence and all the data points that allows us to understand the consumer. Well, the same way you understand the consumer globally, the same way you can change the sea and make it a citizen. And data today allows us to be able to identify and support every citizen on the planet because of the power of
Fantastic.
artificial
The power of AI to reach out to every citizen on the planet, and this is inclusion personified.
Absolutely.
Amira, I turn now to you. Amira is an associate partner at Whiteshield. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Amira, why now? What makes quantum governance relevant now?
So, thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Fadi, and thank you for everyone joining us today. Why quantum governance is important now? When we started doing the research for the book several years ago, it was triggered by a specific paradox of our times, which is that on the one hand, we were witnessing a story of rapid change, rapid progress, rapid technological evolutions that were changing our lives, our economies, our day-to-day consumption as users. And on the other hand, coexisting with this was a narrative of stagnation, inertia, that we were stuck in a status quo, that we were not able to break from that status quo, and that governments were failing to adapt to this new age that we were witnessing. And the consequence of this is multifold. Like we can see what is broadly referred to by economists as the paradox of labor productivity, right? If technology is accelerating to this degree, if we're witnessing so much change, how is it not materializing so quickly in terms of labor productivity growth, in terms of economic growth? We can see it as well in terms of progress in other areas, the Sustainable Development Goals adopted by obviously more than 190 countries around the world, and yet progress is extremely slow. We've done actually some research on this as part of the book, and we've noticed that to be able to stick to the Sustainable Development Goals and actually achieve the targets, we would have to multiply the progress over the past decades by more than 20 times in the remaining period, which is obviously unrealistic. So this paradox in terms of quick change on the one hand, quick progress, at the same time stagnation, inertia, is what pushed us to launch the quantum governance, because all of this stems from a lack of convergence. Some parts of our societies already transitioned to a new paradigm. This new paradigm that is based on data, based on the individual. Other dimensions of our societies are still stuck in the old ways of doing things, still stuck in industrial societies mindset, still stuck in a economic growth-focused mindset and in outdated metrics. To reconcile this, for governments to be able to adapt to this new age, we need quantum governance at this moment.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amira. So what is the framework that you employ, that you've introduced and within this quantum governance book and ideas?
Well, maybe to step back before we talk about the framework. What we identified over the past 4 or 5 years of research, after millions of data points looking at all countries on the planet, that you have in effect 3 types of countries. If we take countries as a unit of analysis, you have countries that do too much. They basically spend a lot of money, efforts in supporting their populations, but in effect are probably doing too much. An example of this is the US or even countries from this region here in the Gulf. You have countries that don't do enough. And those countries are, for example, Costa Rica, Thailand is one, and those countries, frankly, should be doing more to support their citizens. And you have others which are doing just enough. Iceland, Norway, even countries like Gambia. Now, what does it mean, too much or not enough? The main metric that we have identified during the research is what you call the absorptive capacity. So imagine you're in marketing and I throw at you thousands of adverts. You probably will not be able to absorb those adverts. But if I said you only one, you'll be able to understand it, digest it, and therefore absorb it. The issue today is that we have countries where policies are far too strong and wide-reaching and not able to target on a one-to-one basis citizens. And therefore, the framework that we're talking about is the ability to identify the absorptive capacity, how much you could absorb as a citizen, and therefore how much the government should be doing to be able to support the citizen. I'll give you 2 examples. You have in the US today one-to-one education for people of determination. And that means specific hours, specific skills which are being taught. You have today in Denmark flexi work where you have specific contracts for specific individuals. You have in Germany, was one of the key programs that Germany is doing, the ability to preempt healthcare spending by targeting beforehand what is happening, if you're smoking, if you're diabetic, and so on. Those type of initiatives is what we're talking about. Now, that's the generic context. The framework, I'll let my colleague Amira to discuss it first.
So, thank you, Fadi. This overall concept translates into an equation that we came up with, and which summarizes all the key variables contributing to the development of countries or societies at large. This equation relies on three main variables. On the one hand, there's what we call development. And by development, we mean the north of countries. This could be economic growth, it could be sustainable development growth, it could be citizen well-being and social cohesion, any type of goal that is actively pursued by societies. That's your development goals. Then you have a second block, which relates to the policy energy. And this is the amount of efforts, investments put in by policymakers and governments to push the system towards the development goals. Within the energy block, there are different metrics or different variables that matter. It's not just about the public policy itself. First, we need to look at it from a dimension of policy mix. So instead of looking at individual policy instruments, we're looking at it as a network of public policies that we are putting in place, and this notion that we need to look at the mix, not the individual policy instruments. Now, that's one layer. In addition to the policy mix, we need to be looking at the legitimacy, which is the level of trust that citizens have in their leaders, in the system at large, etc., and which acts as a multiplier on the effectiveness of policies. Then we look at the administrative efficiency, and this refers to basically the capabilities of the administrative system of a country to effectively implement its policies and the institutional memory that administrations hold to be able to learn from their mistakes and learn from what worked and what didn't work with these policies in the past. And then finally, within the energy block still, we have the fourth variable, which is the narrative, and which is about the whole communication strategy that is conveyed by policymakers in order to touch individuals on an intangible basis, on their values, on their beliefs, on their convictions, personal convictions. And the combinations of these four variables is what conditions the effectiveness of the energy introduced by governments to help achieve development goals. But that's only one side of the equation. The other side, quite important one, is the quantum learning side. And maybe Faz, you can tell us a bit more.
Thank you. So what Amira just mentioned is in effect the energy that a government can put in place. And this has been done since the dawns of times. Now, the challenge is, if you're going to work with the citizen, how much absorption can happen? And how do you measure it? Now, think about this measurement as being two variables. The first variable is the individual. And the individual is broken down into three areas. Pierre Bourdieu mentioned the habitus, so it's about the economic capital, how much you earn, among other. It's about the social capital, your friends, your network, and it's about the cultural capital, meaning your education, your experience. Now, we have a prism of the world using those three capital into the individual. Us here will be looking at the world differently than someone else based on those three capital that we have. But that is not enough, because the real world is not just us. The real world is also the community. And to measure the community is almost impossible. What is the community? The community is the language, the codes, the myths, the beliefs, all those intangibles that create a certain community. And therefore what we did is to solve for this entire equation, and the X being the seed, this community. And by solving for it, well, it defines different types of countries, and those are the ones that we're talking about, that I just mentioned earlier. But let me step back. This framework is a theoretical framework. Today, what we're doing is using the power of data and artificial intelligence to put it into practice. because what matters today is not just digital transformation. It's not even digital adoption, it's policy adoption. And therefore, interpreting those billions of data points into something meaningful for the citizen, this framework is a way to interpret this data to make something meaningful out of it.
Wonderful. Wow. Listen, what the absorptive capacity, the citizen's absorptive capacity, the way I understood it from reading the book and from listening to you, is that you need to introduce it as another dimension of policy choice.
Yes.
Am I correct? Right. So this is really an insight that I got it confirmed today. Now, with all these complexities that we're facing, and now with the quantum governance issues bringing every single citizen to the equation, how can you empower policymakers to use this tool, let's say, most effectively and most efficiently?
I'll take the question. It's not just a tool, it's the way of thinking about the world. The way we think about the world today, in the age of data, is the ability to use the data to your benefits and artificial intelligence to your benefits. So let me give you two examples. One example is on investors. We're talking citizens, but let's talk investments. If I want to attract investments, I could use an old school approach by looking at which company can come into which country for which reason. But I can also target directly a person within that company which is interested based on web scraping, understanding what is their interest in my specific investment. So therefore connecting the one person to the one investment directly, as opposed to going through the prism of the country, the government, the investment promotion agency, and so on. Practically, the way we're working with governments is by applying something called the balance of policy. And the balance of policy is a diagnostic that we do with governments to understand across the 6 dimensions that we just mentioned, so on the energy on one side, on the absorptive capacity, what we call quantum learning, on the other, where do you stand? And therefore, where you should be intervening. And the concept is very simple. Today, too often, we look at GDP growth as a metric, but GDP growth is just one type of analysis based on the age of capital. Think about it more concretely. You want the government to do enough for the citizen to understand and to be able to adopt and be in line with what the government is trying to do, so that both are happy. There's a win-win that you're trying to get. This win-win is a balance. Think about it like in a balance sheet, you have assets and liabilities. Your assets are the policies you put in place. So we look at different policies being enacted by governments, and we look at what does it mean from an amount of energy spent, and what does it mean from an amount of absorption from the citizen. And if you have a balance, you're in effect doing just enough for what the government needs. If you're doing too much, maybe applying the regulatory guillotine would apply, meaning doing less policies. And if you're not doing enough, then tailoring what should be done for the government and therefore for the citizen. And this is called the balance of policy.
Great. Very, very, very smart. We have a lot of participants from the education sector, right? And by the way, you can send already your questions to the esteemed co-authors online anytime, and then right towards the end, I'll ask those questions to you, and you can address them. Amira, can you give us an example of the policy, how it can be applied to education in particular, right? We have, as I said, we have so many participants from that sector, and they may like to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Raed. Yes, of course. So within the education sector, there has been actually already quite some efforts to move towards this idea of personalizing educational pathways and following more of a one-to-one approach to education delivery. This fits within the wider context of transitioning towards competency-based education. Now, our education systems around the world, particularly tertiary education, are going through a crisis where bachelor degrees, are not anymore a signal of the actual capabilities and competencies of the individuals when they're interviewing. And this is actually pushing employers more and more to disregard the educational background and to look more at concrete skills assessments, capabilities assessments. One reason the education sector is facing these challenges is is because there's this mismatch with the skills needs that are required by the labor market. And at the same time, there isn't enough tailoring of the educational delivery approach to the needs of individualized archetypes. What data allows us to do today is to profile the history of a student from early age, to understand throughout their performance, their competencies in various subjects, in various topics, what are the key strengths of this individual in terms of core competencies, core skills, and to give us early signals that these students might be struggling academically, but might be perhaps more fit for a more practical educational pathway, a more vocational educational pathway. It can give us early signals that an individual might have, let's say, display a very strong entrepreneurial attitude and should be encouraged towards that. So the idea is that if we actually exploit and leverage this vast amount of data that is available within schools, available within governments about each individual students, we would be able to actually guide our future generations to make the right choice, and we would be able to tailor educational pathways for every single one, from what they're studying to how they are assessed as well. And that personalized education experience is what aligns with this competency-based approach to education, and it's what allows to maximize the alignments between our educational system and our economic needs.
Phenomenal. We have now at our disposal a solution to actually solve the skill mismatch, if I understood you correctly, right? And I hope the participants, the audience, got all the details. Now, this is for education. If I were to think about, any target within the SDG, now that, let's say, the climate change issue, that many countries lack, if I were to say it politically correct, progress in achieving that they have subscribed to in terms of their targets across many key performance indicators, most importantly on the sustainability front, right? So how can this tool be harnessed actually today to help countries move along their SDG targets?
So within the book, our research was actually done using the concrete example of the SDGs. And one of the key messages that came out, in addition to this dimension of absorptive capacity, is the need for a whole-of-country approach. There is no SDG that can be achieved using only one policy field or one policy sector, right? If I want to achieve the SDG goals related to green transitions and environmental sustainability, I cannot think of it as having only environmental policies to use. We need to look at it more from this policy mix and network perspective, where education policies will have an impact on our environmental targets. Economic policies will have an impact. So it's not a one-to-one. We cannot act on the environment exclusively through environmental policies. That's one of the first key messages, the strong interlinkages between the SDGs and the various policy instruments. This linkages were actually documented in another practical tool that we've put forward with the book called the Periodic Table of Public Policies. In this periodic table, we took more than 70 major policy instruments used around the world, and we did a network analysis in order to understand the influence that each policy has on other instruments and the level of dependence. And it allowed us to classify, basically, policies into key groups or key clusters. You have, for example, those policies that serve as a basis for everything. And this is where you would have your fundamentals, your judiciary system, your governance system, your public administration system. These policies have a high level of influence across all the goals, regardless of what they are, whether they are environmental or economic or social. They serve as the fundamental basis. And let's say, even if we want to introduce a specific policy instrument, if we have not covered those fundamentals first, it doesn't help. So my recommendation, first and foremost, is not to look at it from a siloed perspective. It's impossible to solve climate change exclusively with, let's say, environmental taxes or environmental subsidies. That's never going to happen. we need to look at it from a whole of country approach.
Very insightful. Fadi, do you want to add?
Maybe just to add to this, I mean, fundamentally, we're talking about having the citizen at the back of the governments, and imagine this being the backbone. We have the prism of what's called the public sector, the private sector, and this is our prism. The reality is it's us, it's people. Now, once we have this as a foundation, there are three implications for governments. So think you wake up tomorrow morning, what do you change? Well, the first is the actual social contracts, where in principle, as a citizen, you pay, let's say, taxes, and then you get a certain service from governments. But today, what you can do is to give your information, your data, and to have individualized service. And that means rethinking the way government actually operates. The second implication is the size of governments. Once you tailor to one-to-one, you don't need that many civil servants, but you need different type of capabilities. You need people that understand artificial intelligence, data processing, data science, a lot more, and to leverage this information to support citizens. But the most important implication is we're talking governments, but what does it mean for companies? You know, how do you change tomorrow morning? Well, for companies, we need to link the accounting system of companies with what the government is doing. And this means that we as individuals are not just a cost, we're actually a capability. And the way we should be measuring people in a company in accounting standards is as knowledge and capabilities. And once you start to measure this, then you can link it back to what the government is trying to do. There's a need to fix also something at the corporate level.
So do more with less.
Absolutely. Right. And use the power of data.
Power of data. Yeah, that's so insightful. Amira, anything for you to add before I turn to the audience who has been very, very patient with us?
Actually, one last note, that perhaps the value proposition of the book is not necessarily to provide answers or a magic public policy mixed, because our whole argument is that doesn't exist, right? There is no magic formula of the optimal public policies that would allow every single country to reach a certain level of development. The problem that we're facing today is we're focusing too much on the how. The first question that policymakers ask is, how do I create jobs? How do I raise entrepreneurship? How do I increase labor productivity? What we're trying to do with the book is to have a framework that forces us to ask fundamental questions, to question a little bit everything that we've taken for granted. So to move more about to the what questions. So, for example, before trying to see how to create jobs, it is relevant today when we discuss the sharing economy, when we discuss the future of work, to ask what is a job to begin with. The ways that we are working are transforming. The full-time traditional corporate 9-to-5 job is not the norm anymore. And for us to be able to have policy solutions that are relevant to our context today, it is worth just taking that step back and asking, okay, what is a job? How do we define a job today in today's economy? And the equation that we've put forward, the purpose of it is to keep these questions ongoing, never to take for granted the answers and think that, you know, there's one strategy that every single country, every single society can replicate to reach their development goals.
Otherwise, we'll be out of a job. Right? I mean, yeah, definitely. So now, with the first question coming from the audience, so either one of you, please, you can take it. Which major organizational changes could be envisaged and how to implement them in order to adopt quantum governance? Amira?
Yeah. So perhaps even before transitioning to the question of organizations, what is needed to be able to make this work in practice is a huge infrastructure in terms of data, digital infrastructure that allows us to actually collect the type of individual level disaggregated data that would allow us to perform this type of analysis. So the backbone of governmental organizations, the backbone of public administration need to be rethought to be purely this digital infrastructure that allows us to cater for this. On top of that, there are also implications on the way public administrations should work and should be organized. So one idea is that with this concept of a whole of country approach, the traditional vision of ministries organized by sectors is not necessarily a relevant one for our times anymore. The idea is to transition more to network-based governmental agencies, where we have representatives from different sectors working together. Again, economy, education, investments, entrepreneurship, etc. That's one thing. And then the second thing is that if governments want to truly embrace the concept of one-to-one policymaking and citizen-centric policymaking, their organizations need to follow that as well. So we have been doing a lot of work, including in the region, with governmental entities on how they can shift their organizational charts to actually support this idea of citizen centricity by rearranging their teams to focus on different types of customers that they service, and which allows to embed this dimension of citizen centricity in the core structure of the administrations themselves.
Anything to add, Fadi?
Fundamentally, we're talking about what Amira is saying, whole of country, but also the way you do this is by using concepts like the government accelerators are being very much used in this region, but it's also by understanding that policy making cannot be done without involving the citizens somehow. Now, we're talking data here, but it's also about listening up front and responding to certain demands. This is what fundamentally what we're talking about. The second aspect of it, which is key, is the ability to not just grasp this information, but also to interpret the information. And today, there's too much time being spent into the interpretation of the information. A lot of reports being done, white papers, and so on, when live data can actually help us to make very tactical decisions and not long-term 5 years decision. So think about policy, not about a long-term action, but about something that can be affected, supported directly. I'll give you an example. In the United Arab Emirates, the NAFIS program was a typical example of acting in less than a month on a specific topic to reduce unemployment levels. Not long-term strategies, very short-term actions, because you have the information to act.
Fantastic, fantastic. Another question now from the audience. How could a typical implementation journey look like if we were to apply this as a government?
I'll take this question. Okay. Typically, what we do is we come in with a short diagnostic up front to understand where are the gaps in terms of what we call the energy and quantum learning. So simply put, what are your public policies? To what extent there is trust into the leadership? To what extent the administration is efficient? And to what extent the narrative which is in place is the right one? And then we measure this compared to what we call the individual and community to see where is the gap. Are you doing too much or not enough? And this is a very short diagnostic because we use, as a firm, a lot of information. We own a lot of data already, more than 150 million data points to come up with this diagnostic up front. And we complement it with the data of the policymaker. After that, it's about applying algorithms, meaning big data solutions, together with government to tailor specific actions. So don't think about it about a lot of paperwork. It's much more adopting, for example, the reduction of smoking for a certain city. If you want citizens to stop smoking or to reduce the level of smoking, well, it's to stratify the population, to go down to the one-to-one to understand what could be done at this point in case. Every use case is then important. We're not talking about generic solutions, but very specific solutions.
Excellent. And here's a question that I think came from a policymaker. How long could it take to reap initial results?
Amira?
So, for me, if we the key thing to keep in mind is this dimension of moving a bit past the inertia that can happen when we talk about wicked policy challenges, right? So like Fadi was saying, the idea is not necessarily 5 years, 10 years, let's change fundamentally, let's say, the way we do things, because whenever governments think long-term, they become stuck in this inertia of no action on the ground. So how long could it take to reap the benefits? As Fadi was saying, as quickly as possible. The idea is that to start with smaller changes that are more easily to process by policymakers, by institutions like governments, to adopt an experimental approach as well to policymaking. Because in a lot of contexts, even with the data, we are faced with uncertainty. We are unsure whether a certain policy will work in a specific context within a specific timeline in a specific country, despite all the vast amount of data that we might have. In this case, the idea is to turn to experimental policy approaches, right? We launch a pilot, we're able to adapt very quickly. We look at the key beneficiaries that will benefit from this policy, how they feel about it, and then turn it around to adapt to the individual needs. So the idea is not to get stuck in terms of like structural long-term, and adopt more of a experimental approach to policymaking to be able to reap those benefits quicker.
Fantastic, but sorry, Fadi.
And let me add that we're here talking during the World Government Summit. This region, and Sam Altman was mentioning yesterday that there's a great opportunity in the region to have AI sandbox that could be used in the region. This region has an amazing opportunity to improve return on policy via the usage of personalized data, via the great projects like Falcon, to be able to really reap these benefits and to act almost immediately to support citizens.
And it so happens, Fadi, that there's a really relevant question in that vein from the audience. What kind of skills does the government teams need to acquire to accelerate implementation? So what are the skills we're talking about? I mean, this is we're moving away from conventional economics, right, into something pretty new. So what kind of skills would you require of the government teams to actually take this quantum governance and move forward?
So maybe I will get started, Amira, over to you. We definitely have to move away from the traditional school of government that teaches just diplomacy and economics, and because we're economists and no economist has predicted the future ever, or maybe once, I don't know, probably not. It's rather thinking, having graduates understands their community, that understands their people, that understand what the focus group is about, using the data to understand the citizens, to be much closer to the community, number one. And number two, to be able to have much more skill sets in the data science, in econometrics, but to link those two, to be able to use data and to leverage it for their own benefits. This is a major shift from the traditional last 200 years way of having schools of government, which was much more traditional on policy and economics.
Actually, this idea of quantum learning and the absorptive capacity can be applied to the government's employees as well, right? So if, say, tomorrow that we overwhelm governmental organizations with digital transformations, with new tools, with new digital infrastructure, but the employees of such administrations do not have the absorptive capacity to actually leverage these tools and these digital assets, then the benefits that we're expecting to reap from these digital transformations and upgrades of the governmental agencies won't actually materialize. So, as mentioned by Fadi, is to be able to approach even the governmental employees from that perspective of individuals that have needs, to be able to upskill them in terms of how to utilize this amount of data, how to utilize these new technologies that they have at hand to augment their performance as a prerequisite before jumping into the fancy tools and fancy digital transformations.
Thank you, Amira. You've mentioned the SDGs as a big motivator, a big part of the quantum governance book itself. And here's a question from the audience. How can quantum governance help achieve SDG goals? Is it worth connecting these messages to accelerate adoption?
So maybe I'll do the same. I'll get started. We're in active discussions with international organizations, because the point of the achievement of the SDGs is what is the balance between amount of energy dimensions and the absorptive capacity. If you do too much and citizens cannot absorb, you'll be delayed on achieving the SDGs. And then the reverse is the equal answer. It's doing just enough. And doing just enough is the ability to measure this balance between energy and absorptive capacity. And countries that are able to match this are the fastest in achieving their SDGs. I mentioned Norway, Iceland, even countries like Gambia. When you look at the acceleration on SDGs, they're much faster than any other country. So the solution is not in doing too much or not enough, it's doing just what's right between what the citizen can absorb and what the government should be doing.
Right. Anything to add, Amira?
And this balance that Fadi is describing allows not only to accelerate progress in terms of achieving material fungible goals, but at the same time maintaining a certain level of social cohesion as an intangible objective that is pursued by any society, any country around the world. So the same countries that Fadi is describing that were able to accelerate their progress in terms of jobs, in terms of environmental transitions, in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of youth employment, are also those countries that manage to maintain strongly cohesive societies where individuals claim to be happier, more connected to their community, etc. So this balance between energy and quantum learning is not just about the speed of progress, it's also about the ability to do it in a way that doesn't break societies, that doesn't disrupt societies, and conserving the social cohesion.
Thank you, Amira. You mentioned the NAFIS program, right? And here's a question that came from the audience, another question. How can quantum governance be used to actually increase the labor market participation rate of Emiratis or any, in any country?
So actually, employment, active labor market policies in general is a subject where it becomes quite easy to grasp this notion of absorptive capacity. Why? Because there's something called the non-take-up, right? A lot of governments introduce social benefits and employment benefits, training policies, but face a low take-up rate by their citizens. No one is actually using these policies, or at least not using them to the extent that was expected. And then governments are puzzled because why aren't our citizens using the policies that we've introduced? It's free money, it's free trainings for them, and yet no one is taking it up. It's because of this notion of absorptive capacity. Are they even aware of it? Are you using the right delivery channel to reach them? For example, if your active labor market policies are being delivered digitally and the majority of your target audience live perhaps in remote regions, do not necessarily have access to digital platforms, or are not necessarily digitally literate, then you're already excluding them. You're not even able to deliver the medicine, the policy to them, right? So the idea is that when confronted with a challenge such as unemployment, the key is, again, that we're able to understand first who is the citizen that we're talking about. Is it a young female working in a remote region with a bachelor degree? Is it an older male living in an urban area and who has only a high school degree? That exercise of mapping out who are the people that we're talking about and what are their unique, differentiated needs to be able to transition to employment is the step zero, most fundamental one.
Fantastic. And this triggered, like a question from myself. Now that you're trying to actually adjust, a macro policy, let's say, right? Say, I want to increase the labor market participation rate of, a certain segment even, right? And then you want to target each demographic, let's say. Aren't we at the same time asking and tasking actually the government with more responsibilities to be able to reach? I understand the need to reach that last citizen in a remote area, right? But how does that affect the government's resources in terms of delivery?
If I can take that question, I think we have to, the point of the book is to rethink the system. And rethinking is not a theoretical question. Today, The GAFAs, the ex-GAFAs, the Googles and the Metas and so on, have access to incredible amounts of data. And we're still talking government and private sector on one side. But imagine a collaboration between the two. Imagine a collaboration where this is not confrontational, but it's actually a potential exchange of information with consent of the individual, of course, where this information is used. Then you don't play karate, you play judo. You leverage this information that already exists, where, as I mentioned, someone can already tell me what I should be buying when I go on a certain platform, but I use it for the public good. And I use it in collaboration with governments to tailor a specific solution. The idea is not to replicate what is happening in the private sector, is to leverage it and maybe to reduce the amount of taxes being paid because you're exchanging information for the benefits of a certain population. Let me step back. The main message of the book is that today we've been moving from, back in the 80s and 90s, from data that was on paper to data in the 90s and 2000 that was on a computer that was digital. And then we moved to the age of having dashboards which are beautiful to give you every single type of information. Today we have the needs to take this information and to interpret it in a certain way. And this book is one of the keys to interpret the information for policymakers to have the highest return on policy.
Thank you. Anything you want to add? I have one more question from the audience, right? So since we move from organizational siloed view into multi-sectoral approaches, who should be the main sponsor of such initiatives in the government? Who should be?
Maybe I'll give you two cases of clients that we're working with. There's no one size fits all here. It depends on the coalition of the willing, on who is willing to actually take that leap forward. One case is a government where one entity is willing to take the leads and to discuss this with other entities and to build a backbone behind it where you have citizen data, but someone has to take the lead. This is the bottom-up approach. The top-down approach, it's not who as one entity, is who in the sense of what is the driver behind the change. And the who ultimately is not government, it's citizen. The accountability should be with the citizen saying, I demand to have A, B, and C. And when you see this, you see change which is happening a lot faster than government-driven change. That collaboration is what we're talking about.
That collaboration will move you away from the siloed approach.
Absolutely.
Right?
Because at the end, you have a citizen where you know what they want in terms of economic returns, in terms of family support, in terms of healthcare, in terms of education. And that unit doesn't change. And once you have this unit, everyone else should be centered around this need.
One of the challenges that it just occurred to me that when you move away from the siloed approach, it might become much more challenging to actually identify the owner of that policy. The owner and ultimately the one who will be called to task at the end of the day to show whether the results have been achieved or the desired result have been met or not met. How can we solve this? Or is it just a perceived...
The main metric, the dashboard that we're looking at is not just having different departments with different indicators. There's only one indicator, the citizen metric. And imagine this being worked backwards across different entities. Every department, every ministry would then have a part of the KPI that relates to that citizen. And that's the core change, as opposed to generic KPIs that sometimes overlap. If you talk productivity, well, who's in charge of productivity? If you talk innovation, who's in charge of innovation? If time environment support. But if you go back to the citizen, the KPI is much easier. Simplicity.
Do you agree, Amira?
Actually, absolutely. And one of the key points is that we actually need this change in the incentive structure to align the accountability of government officials with this end goal. So if today, if today government officials are still judged by traditional metrics, they need to achieve certain KPI in terms of money spent in such educational program or such training program, etc. These siloed KPIs maintain the level of accountability at a sector level. So what you're describing, Raed, is a key prerequisite to break from the status quo, right? If they are only looking at their own sectorial targets, then obviously we're not going to be able to achieve this whole of country approach because the incentive to work together is not there. So it's about finding this one unique common metric that holds everyone accountable across the government.
Fantastic. With that thought, we come to the end of our session. I want to thank you.
Thank you
for your insights, for your thoughts, provoking ideas. Thanks to the audience for their time and effort. And please excuse my voice. I came down with a cold this morning. So this is where we are. And thank you so very much. And goodbye.